Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's town hall on the Psychiatric Emergency Response Team, better known as PERT. I'm Brian Bonner, and I'm the first vice president of the San Diego branch of NAACP. Our president, Francine Maxwell, is unable to be here, but she welcomes you and hopes you will find tonight's meeting, town hall, to be informative and useful. The branch Criminal Justice Committee organized this town hall, and it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Robert Brown, chairman of the committee. Dr. Brown, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone, and especially to our guests, Dr. Marvin and Mr. Wes Albers of PERT. As you all know, PERT is an extremely important resource to the citizens of our county. And without going into long detail, I just want to say on behalf of the NAACP, we're grateful. We're looking forward to seeing how we can be more of a resource. And again, thank you so much for coming. And we look forward to you being involved with us at the NAACP and other ventures as well, as time permits. Again, thank you. And I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Tonight, we have Dr. Marvin and Wes Albers. So without further ado, take it away, gentlemen.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Brian, and also for Chris out there for doing the initial reach out. We're highly honored to be part of this town hall at the NAACP. So I also want to welcome fellow members and folks who aren't members who are curious about this great organization. I guess we'll start with introductions. Wes, you want to lead off, and why don't you tell us who you are, and then I'll chip in who I am. Thanks.
So Wes Albers, I'm the community liaison for PERT. I have been with PERT full-time for about a year and a half now, just coming up on a year and a half. Prior to that, I spent a little over 30 years with the San Diego Police Department. I retired as a detective sergeant overseeing juvenile operations up in our northwestern portion of the city. And I spent the last decade of my career, much of my career was spent in crisis intervention and ground level intervention, but I spent over the last decade managing our hostage and crisis negotiations for the entire city of San Diego. We have a robust team of negotiators, some 50 plus trained people, including members of FBI and NCIS who assist. And we work really collaboratively with other agencies, a lot of different groups out there to design strategies for how do we de-escalate, how do we negotiate, and certainly what we were there for was kind of the really high order stuff. So a lot of times you wouldn't see the negotiators, but they were in the background. If it was a SWAT mission, if it was an individual up on the bridge. So a great deal of my life and background has been in intervening early on. However, as a PERT utilizer, I was a young officer when PERT started, and I used them early on for a community issue or concern where someone was really struggling, and with kind of the collaboration of PERT, the VA, drug court, a whole bunch of different providers, we were able to really kind of craft something to help this individual. So I have been an advocate, a utilizer, and now a representative of pretty much for the entirety of PERT's existence. So I'm grateful to be here. Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Wes. Again, Dr. Marvin, I'm a licensed psychologist. I have kind of two diverse aspects of my career. Since about the mid-1980s when I moved out here from Michigan, I've been with Community Research Foundation, CRF for short. So if you don't know about CRF, there's 30 plus programs spread around the county of San Diego that provide services to young ones and older ones, everything in between. But a lot of those folks are struggling with severe and persistent mental illness. Concurrently, for many years, I've been a police psychologist in various organizations, a local law enforcement, and some federal agencies. And a little over about 6 years ago, this opportunity to become the director of PERT came up. And to me, it really meant almost a perfect marriage of these two aspects of my career, combining law enforcement with mental health services. I had been a big fan of peer support within law enforcement. And I also used to be, as a psychologist, in on the negotiations team with the San Diego Police Department. So I'm very honored to be selected to PERT. And this presentation tonight, we're going to kind of look at PERT from a couple different angles. One would be the clinical responses, the resources that we provide the community. And I also want to talk about the training that we do for county law enforcement, because we actually provide the bulk of mental health intervention training for our local law enforcement. But a little bit down history lane. So back in the mid-90s, 1990s, some local citizens, law enforcement, community members, persons who had lived with severe mental illness, had that experience, got together to try to look at, is there a better way for law enforcement to be able to intervene with someone who's in a mental health crisis? And the impetus for this gathering came out of some officer-involved shootings involving people living with severe and persistent mental illness. And from that task force, PERT was launched. So believe it or not, this is our 25th year of operation. And I got to tell you, it gives us great pride when we hear supposedly breaking news from some major cities in this country and elsewhere, where they're announcing that they're going to try a radical program that would be actually having a mental health clinician pair with law enforcement to assist the community. So we feel really good about our legacy here. And I have to say, it's all about collaboration. And that's just a wonderful thing here in San Diego County. Los Angeles has it up there as well. But I got to tell you, I haven't felt it or experienced it anywhere else in the country. In fact, that's one of the initial questions outside cities will ask me is, how do you get all these folks, behavioral health people, community members, Rational Recovery, for instance, Recovery International, NAMI, Behavioral Health Services, law enforcement together? And it just is a wonderful thing. And we really owe a good of gratitude to the community because we listen to what's happening and what's not happening out there. But what we have at this point in time, I should say we're funded through Behavioral Health Services of San Diego County. So we're a nonprofit company. The lifeblood of our budget comes from the Mental Health Service Act funding, MHSA funding, and that is also commonly referred to in California as the millionaire's tax. So a 1% tax goes into mental health, behavioral health funding. And that really, again, is our lifeblood and really has allowed for our expansion of these teams over the years. So we have 70 clinicians who are paired with our 11 local law enforcement agencies. And we also have 2 clinicians who are paired with the San Diego Fire and Rescue RAP program, which RAP stands for Resource Access Program, which I'll get into in just a minute. And then we have various divisions or the setup for the organization that allows us to have really excellent quality assurance and control and communication with our clinicians. All of our clinicians are licensed as mental health clinicians. So we have registered nurses who have extensive psychiatric experience. We have licensed marriage and family counselors, licensed professional counselors, social workers, and psychologists. Our clinicians have that extensive experience, which is really vital to completing our mission in a very compassionate and effective way. Our clinicians have to pass a security background investigation on the civilian level, which is conducted by the San Diego Sheriff's Department. Now, the reason for this is, well, there's a few reasons, but the main one is, you think about it this way. We have clinicians riding with the officers the entire shift. They don't come into the PERT office prior to the start of their shift. They go right to the station. So if I'm a clinician and I'm assigned, let's say, a Northern Division of the San Diego Police Department, I go right to Northern Division. That's how I start my shift. And of course, they're privileged to hear all kinds of information, very confidential information of a law enforcement nature. Our clinicians, we have a training program. We just don't kind of throw them out there. So there's a several-week program for them to get acclimated, not only to this challenge of actually conducting assessments and evaluations, sometimes literally out in the field, but for many of them, it's also getting them accustomed to law enforcement culture, to understand how things work, the role of the officer versus the role of the clinician, which we'll get into in a little bit as well. Let me say a few words about our emergency medical services pilot program, the 2-clinician program. The focus of this program is quite proactive in that these clinicians are paired with community paramedics. And what they do is they go and try to cultivate relationships with the highest utilizers of the EMS 911 system in San Diego. And what San Diego Fire and Rescue found, that a lot of these people, not too surprisingly, were really suffering with ongoing mental health issues. And we had found out that they actually, a lot of them were not connected to services. So again, by frequent contacts and just trying to get to know them and building trust, maintaining trust, driving them to appointments for healthcare, be it physical healthcare or behavioral healthcare. That program's been quite successful too. And of course, we know that this is a highly trauma-informed program. You have community paramedics showing up in an unmarked kind of a vehicle and getting them connected. And if these folks are connected, let's face it, law enforcement happens to be probably interacting with the same individuals in their various jurisdictions. So we feel really good about this program. That's been up for about two years at this point. One of the things that we have, which is kind of unique in San Diego, is our collaboration with the local fusion center. Probably hardly any of you have heard what a fusion center is. A fusion center is a center for ensuring communication amongst various law enforcement agencies. So after the 9/11 terrorist attacks and some of the debriefs, what they realized that there needs to be a little more enhanced communication from between the federal agencies amongst them and also with local law enforcement. So we actually get quite a few referrals each month from our local fusion center, which is referred to as the Law Enforcement Coordination Center. Unfortunately, this might sound kind of scary, but a lot of these referrals involve people who are planning perhaps mass casualty events. For instance, we get referrals from the FBI. Earlier this week, we were working on a case that had been referred by the Secret Service regarding an individual in our county who was planning attacks on elected officials. So very highly intense kinds of scenarios, but it's quite successful. And if I can humbly say that the national headquarters of the FBI were very impressed with this, again, the collaboration that we have out here, and they're hoping to actually duplicate this model in every large city in the United States. Our clinicians, when they're out there in the field, the majority of them are with officers who are responding to all kinds of calls, not just mental health calls. There are roughly about a dozen or so clinicians that are aligned with officers whose sole purpose is to merely respond to mental health type of calls. We don't have more than that number simply because of the staffing of the local law enforcement agencies. But what will happen is when a call comes in, typically through the 911 system or the non-emergency number, what will happen is this unit will be dispatched, if available, to that scene. our clinicians have a great advantage in that we have access to the electronic health record of the county. The platform is known as Cerner. So while our clinician and their law enforcement partner are en route to the scene, our clinician can start to do a little bit of research and kind of get a sense of what this person's history is, because in this record also will be very important information, such as whether or not they are currently open to behavioral health services, which might mean we will call that provider to try to get an update to clue them in what's happening and when their next appointment might be. Family members, emergency contact members, and this really gives us an advantage getting there. And then once we arrive at the scene, Wes, you want to talk about the role of the officer?
So a lot of what we do, it's really about understanding the boundaries and how we can interact and how we support each other from the officer end and the clinician end to kind of reinforce what our strengths are and bolster each other's weaknesses to some degree. So the officer's there for a number of reasons. First and foremost, much of what we go to, there's some element of risk or volatility, maybe some undefinable element of risk that simply going in from a clinical end might put someone at a heightened level of risk. So the officer is there to help assess and to be prepared, certainly for maybe some of that more highly volatile stuff. So they take care of the safety bubble around this clinician so that they can get there, but that the clinician is there as soon as is conceivably possible to start to partner with the problem solving here, and how do we start to evaluate what we have, what might be the best ways we can intervene. So it's very much a team component, but the officer deals with the safety. But also in the midst of that, like Dr. Marvin saying, you know, sometimes we're dealing with these scenarios that maybe it's a referral of somebody that presents an unknown risk, maybe a potential of catastrophic risk. So the officer has a couple of things. One is the safety component of that, the pre-planning, the need to maybe notify a supervisor and come up with a different plan so we're not just racing in unprepared. But when they get there, they also have to look at, is this a criminal issue? Is it a mental health issue? Or is it some kind of combination of the two? And we run the range of all of that, all the way to and including, it might be a mental health issue that is not even actionable for like a transport or for anywhere. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But so the officer will render the scene safe. They'll make that assessment for whether it's crime or mental health, and then kind of separate that from the clinical portion. The clinician then will come in and they'll do their assessment. And this is where having that license helps, because we're talking master's level education with 3,000 hours of clinical work, compared to, you know, in this county, our law enforcement, we'll talk about training as we get further into this, we're above what a lot of places, most places in this country are, but it's not that degree of education and practical experience. So the clinician can get in there and really help and start doing a deeper assessment of, does this person meet 5150 criteria? Are they a danger to themselves, a danger to others, or are they gravely disabled? And they can help. They're authorized by the County of San Diego to write that 5150 declaration, that determination form, so to speak, of whether this person meets the criteria. Now, meeting criteria is not a diagnosis. It's a probable cause legal standard. So the clinician can help with that, but then the other portion of what the officer is there for is to do that lawful detention and transport. The clinician, even though they can determine this person meets criteria for an involuntary transport to a mental health facility for an evaluation, that doesn't give them the authority to transport that person there if they don't want to go. Law enforcement has the authority to do that. So that's the kind of the other part of the pairing for why we have law enforcement there. That includes this kind of range of calls that we go to. Might start with, at the very low order, all it is a referral of resources. Someone is starting to get into crisis. They become aware of challenges, family member calls, a friend calls, police and PERT come out. They don't meet criteria, we refer them to a resource. If they do meet criteria, then we can take them to county mental health, to the emergency screening unit. We can take them into any of a number of LPS hospitals, which are emergency departments with the psychiatric facility connected to them. So we have a number of different choices there that we could take someone to. And potentially, you know, in those instances where someone does end up going to jail, which is really a small, very small percentage, but in that instance, the clinician can still write a documentation. So say we have someone under arrest for felony crime, but they're feeling suicidal, the clinician can do the assessment, communicate with the jail nurse to help facilitate appropriate housing or more appropriate housing for that individual to address not only the jail needs, but the mental health needs. And a lot of times that's where they start kind of getting their first introduction. Mark, do you want to talk on that and the nature of calls?
Yes. Again, as I mentioned, as most of our clinicians are partnered with that officer, they might be responding to a burglary call, and the dispatcher has no idea, the information wasn't conveyed. There's no hint that a mental health variable is at play. Maybe the person is delusional and thinking that if they vandalize something, they're going to, you know, help the world in some aspect. Our clinicians are trained to assert themselves and get involved and say to their officer, hey, I think there's some mental health issues. You know, I'm going to talk with this person. And by identifying that variable in that case, or sometimes this happens when there's a pre-existent warrant that's going to be served, our clinician just happens to be with that officer at that place, and we will make that assessment. And as Wes says, we do communicate that to detention bureau staff, jail staff, verbally and in writing. And this is probably one of the I don't know, I guess, I don't know if I'd say satisfying, but a neat aspect. I've actually had a few ex-inmates and their family members thank me on behalf of PERT for actually identifying that mental health variable at the time of their incarceration. And I have to say, just on the side, Detentions Bureau has really upgraded their mental health capacity and involvement with inmates over the last several years. And I know I can tell you that if someone does go to jail, they're going to get connected with services. Treatment's going to start in the jails, and they're going to be connected with referrals when they're let out of incarceration. The other aspect that we have, I probably should also mention, is our connection with some of the homeless outreach teams in the county. For instance, we have 3 clinicians with San Diego Police Department's homeless outreach team. We have one with Chula Vista, one with Escondido, and pretty much a part-time position through the Sheriff's Department. This is a little different than responding to 911 calls. And this is more akin as what I mentioned earlier about our San Diego Fire Association with the RAP program. This is a very proactive endeavor that sometimes requires months and months of building trust with homeless persons, literally in the canyons and the riverbeds. And we talk about sometimes you have to measure success by as if they're little grains of sand on the beach. You have to be very, very patient. And I have to say the officers on these homeless outreach teams are superb, very compassionate. And that's a very exciting aspect of our program as well. I also want to say, even though our clinicians have that vast experience, we are set up in a very highly structured supervisory manner to ensure our quality of services. So we have our 60 clinicians out there, then we have 10 team leads who are in essence their immediate supervisors out in the field. And then at the PERT office, we have 4 field operations supervisors who oversee the operations and are available for consultations. In fact, anytime there's a concern about dangerousness to others, we mandate that our clinicians have a call in, a conference call. Again, it's all about collaboration. And many times Wes gets involved in those discussions. Certainly I do. Our assistant program director, Christine Davies, will get involved. And I gotta tell you, what makes this work is just slowing it down. So when we arrive on scene, we're not just thinking hospital or no hospital. You really have to have a conversation with someone and to really kind of go where that pain is, to really comprehend the whole context of a person's crisis. And of course, as you can imagine, many times the person whom we are intervening with really doesn't want us there, or doesn't maybe realize that they have a mental health condition and what's happening. So when available, we will talk with bystanders. Typically it would be family members or other supports as well. And this is extremely important, again, to get context for the opportunity to assist someone. The 5150 process that Wes mentioned is one of those terms that I think it gets, there's a lot of misleading information about that. So the 5150 process is actually not placing someone on a 72-hour hold. All that really is for us to ensure a safe and orderly transport to a hospital for further assessment by usually a psychiatrist at that facility to determine whether or not that person meets criteria for the additional time for treatment to begin. So if you can slow it down at the scene and have a conversation and problem solve a little bit, oftentimes we probably find that someone doesn't meet criteria, really doesn't need a hospitalization, but there might be a lower level of care, a least restrictive kind of level of care. That might be to a residential treatment program, one of the START programs. It could be maybe just driving them over to their treatment provider for a session, or maybe a medication consultation. So we look at all kinds of aspects to get people connected. And because we have a lot of challenging cases out there within the system, we do hold monthly roundtable meetings with providers in the various regions of the county to convene and just to make sure we're all on the same page to help persons out. And that seems to be quite successful as well.
And Mark, if I can interject here, because what I want to talk about is the value of those collaborative efforts and that discussion that goes on there, not only in the field, but like tonight, where we're sitting here together and we're collaborating. A lot of the people that we deal with, life is complex, it's messy. Challenges that we have in our lives are not so simple as one issue or another issue. It's obviously, or it's often a complex mix of issues. Where there's mental health, there's often substance abuse. Where there is mental health and substance abuse, there's often victimization in the background, bad life choices. It gets really complex really quickly. So part of that is slowing it down and collaborating in the moment when stuff's going on. But it's also discussions like this tonight or during the day. And one of the benefits that Mark and I have of our positions is that we get to collaborate with a lot of different agencies. My role in and of itself is to communicate law enforcement to the medical and mental health community, medical and mental health community to law enforcement, but I'm also talking to community groups, to individual care providers from other non-hospital locations, custodial locations. So, and we're looking at different ways of, are we providing the best care or not? And so when you look at an individual that crosses over a number of systems, law enforcement, the courts, the hospitals, whether it's the medical system or the mental health system or some combination, the rehab community, when you have someone that gets contact in each of those groups or each of those systems, everybody has a different approach. And sometimes those approaches mesh, sometimes not so much. Sometimes there's great distrust between groups dealing with the same individual. And one of the benefits we really have by our job, which I love, is that we get the opportunity to engage in conversations of how could we maybe improve things going forward. And we get to have a voice as part of the community to look at ways that we can improve service. So it's not even just at the ground level, it's for the big picture and looking at ways to improve service. Mark?
Yeah, let's talk about the training for a while, what we offer law enforcement. It's interesting in the audience today, I see quite a few of our collaborators with training. So again, as I mentioned, we provide pretty much the bulk of mental health crisis intervention training to our local law enforcement partners. Our trainings are approved by the California Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Trainings, otherwise known as POST for short. The purpose of these trainings, they are not to make law enforcement officers clinicians, not by any means. The purpose of these trainings is to really kind of increase a sense of mindfulness, awareness of these mental health issues, to recognize signs, symptoms, and not only what to say, but oftentimes what not to say or how to interact. What might seem to be the logical thing to say to someone who's delusional, for instance, is, well, that's not true. You're not the president. You don't do that. You don't say something like that. So to connect with the feelings and the thoughts, and again, just to slow it down. We have various offerings for law enforcement. We call a PERT 3-day academy for officers who want to be partnered with a PERT clinician. They go through this 3-day academy. We have various menus of 1-day academies, crisis intervention training. We also have a post-certified dispatcher training, and we also have a wonderful partnership with the DA's office to provide de-escalation training as well. So again, the purpose of these trainings, we don't get into diagnostics too much, but just to recognize, what are you supposed to do if someone's delusional? If someone's hearing voices, if someone all of a sudden gives you a blank stare, it probably doesn't mean that they're being oppositional defiant. Perhaps they're hearing voices to not talk to you, right? So again, we want them to slow it down. And a big part of this training actually is stigma. In fact, for me, one of the, way back in the day when I got involved as a police psychologist, I kind of saw law enforcement and psychological services as the final frontier of psychological services, because I knew it wasn't too well accepted. I knew that because I had some friends in law enforcement when I was back in Michigan. So, and I gotta tell you though, the climate, the culture has changed so much over the last few decades. At this point, I find that the officers and deputies are really hungry to get this information, because first of all, they realize, because unfortunately, the nature of severe and persistent mental illness, that there's a high likelihood they're going to be interacting with these same individuals and their family members, perhaps their whole career. And when you're doing these interventions, these are not one-off interventions. When you're having an intervention with someone in crisis and or their family members, you're really setting the tone for any follow-up intervention, be it with that officer, that department, or officers from some other jurisdiction. So again, to establish trust and to maintain trust and to slow it down and to really listen to that person I like to tell officers, it would be the best compliment you could probably ever have is for someone out in the community whom you've had contact with, for them not to say, my gosh, that was really a great interrogation I had with that officer, but rather something along the lines of, you know what, that was a pretty cool conversation I had with that officer. I'm kind of surprised, that, and by doing this, you're kind of busting that whole, well, you're trying anyway, the stigma of mental health issues. And not only for the community member, but for officers as well, because we do talk about their wellness. And I believe a huge part to be successful in an intervention in law enforcement is to be really in tune with your own emotional intelligence, which is basically understanding your own buttons, right? And be able to have a sense of empathy, and not that you can fully understand what somebody's going through, but just kind of take it in and try to experience that from their perspective, try to step in their shoes. And of course, what we find when I do anonymous polling at our training sometimes, and I ask the question, have you or anyone in your family of origin or your immediate family ever been psychiatrically hospitalized? And there's an anonymous thing, they text their answers in there. I think the lowest we've ever had was somewhere around 18% of the class. I think the highest we ever had was 48%. So right off the get-go, this isn't an us versus them. This is how it is out there, and to be respectful. And we talk not only about the more severe and persistent mental disorders, such as, say, for instance, schizophrenia, but we also talk about kids' issues, such as autism, for instance. And what's really wonderful is that the officers will share their experiences, their family experiences. With POST, again, the California Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training, what I really like about this state agency that oversees law enforcement training is they really insist on an interactive, introspective experience. So it's not PowerPoint. In fact, that's probably why we don't have a PowerPoint here today, because I don't like PowerPoint. So, and we have a lot of small group exercises, and we do role plays, use of force role plays. We act out certain scenarios, and they're being evaluated by defensive tactical instructors on their communication. How are they communicating with each other? So for instance, in this county, with all the local agencies, the procedure is contact and cover. A contact officer takes the lead in the interaction, and the cover officer is basically monitoring for safety. Okay, how are those two officers interacting with each other in this scenario? How are they talking on the radio? Did they ask for PERT? Did they ask for other resources? Did they slow it down? Because with our county de-escalation policy that I was honored to be part of, we really have 3 phases. And the first phase is really crucial. It's pre-planning. You just don't go into a scene. You have to have a plan based upon the information that you have. And if you don't think you have much information, how can you get that information without escalating the situation, right? You don't need to be in a hurry. Just, kind of, again, slow it down, have a dialogue, think conversation, and try to get some information. So that's really crucial, just on the heads up part before you actually decide what you're going to do. So no preconceived judgments about this person. Even if you've had several interactions with this person over the last week, you have to take each encounter as a unique opportunity. So we also, go ahead, Wes.
I was going to say, Mark, on that, not only do we bring the DTAC instructors, the defensive tactics instructors that will talk about that pre-planning, the tactics, the strategies they're using, but we've started bringing in negotiators as well to focus in on the interpersonal communications, the tone of voice, the eye contact, the way that they're carrying their behaviors, their body language. Are they respectful? Are they using active listening? And more we're spending time, at least from our end, introducing more concepts of how to employ active listening. For instance, as a strategy, as a negotiator, for instance, I don't just call you up if you're barricaded in your house and go, "Hi, it's Wes. What's going on, man?" I have a plan. And if I have time before I make that call, I'm writing out how I'm going to go about that plan. I'm thinking it through. I'm rehearsing it so that when I call, I have a strategy for that communication. So for example, I will look at this and I will use active listening skills and I'll go, okay, I'm going to talk to someone. I got to make a phone call. My first thing I want to do is introduce myself and make a personal connection. Tell them who I'm with. I want to identify whether they're safe and reinforce that that safety is important for me. So that's some stuff I want to get at. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an introduction, and then I'm going to follow that with some kind of summary or a paraphrase of what's going on or information I have. I'm going to ask them a direct question about if they're okay. And then I'm going to identify an emotion and ask an open-ended question. So the way that those strategy of those different tools kinds of comes out is, "Hi, I'm Wes with the police department. I can only imagine that there's a lot going on in there and it's really frightening right now. Are you okay? Is everyone else okay? Can you tell me what's going on in there?" So I've employed active listening skills as individual strategies, just the same as when I was an officer. I would come in and I would say, okay, I got to come in at this angle. I got to approach from this because I got to be able to look at my safety. I got to get containment to this person. So language becomes as much a strategic effort as the hands-on. So we started using negotiators to help officers kind of communicate with that. And the big thing there is these are perishable skills. So we need to keep reinforcing those. And that's really kind of the big thing we're trying to do on the other end of that. We're also looking at keeping the officers' minds open to, oftentimes training moves in, the problem keeps getting bigger. How do we keep scaling up for it? But we'll look at ways of, is it really the problem we think it is? We come in and the behaviors and the information we might have might look like it's really volatile or it's really criminal and really serious. But if we start getting information that helps us reassess that, how do we train to kind of step back rather than just the continually building until there's some kind of action point? So there's a lot of stuff that goes on in how we approach our training that's well beyond just the tactics and the officer safety component of that. Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Wes. That was great. So that conversation, and we've probably all been guilty of this. You know, somebody tells you something and you want them to feel better. "Oh, don't worry, you can get another girlfriend. You know, I'm sure there's a lot of fish in the sea," these things. So we tell officers, don't say that. You know, the goal here, no one's on fire. You're not out there putting out the fire. But God, that sounds terrible. You know, tell me about it. And even if it's against your value system, you have to kind of go there. And I like to tell them, if you don't know what to say, and I guess I would recommend this to everybody here, I'm kind of infamous for that, saying this, but all you have to say is, "Tell me more." You know, and this is really a wonderful thing because communication can be enhanced not only with contacts out in the field, but I tell officers, you know, this is going to make your lives less stressful. You know, it's going to improve your family life. You know, just kind of get in there a little bit. And it's really, you know, it might sound kind of easy. It really isn't easy. It takes a lot of practice doing that, but see what happens. In addition to the role plays, we use the force option simulator in most of our one-day training events. Force option simulator is essentially an enhanced video game almost, where you have the officers interacting with a scenario on a screen, a pre-filmed scenario, and through a computer, you know, we are able to manipulate the outcome. We can have somebody become agitated. We can have somebody kind of calm down, back and forth. So it's the same situation. Defensive tactical instructors are evaluating for the safety aspect, and someone like myself will debrief the psychological aspects, and we will tie in the psychological aspects, their awareness of such with their decision if they did use any kind of force, be it a taser or whatnot within this scenario. For instance, how many times can you say, drop the knife, drop the knife, drop the knife, you know, the broken record, you know? Why don't you say, geez, it looks like you're having a hard time. You're crying underneath a tree in the park here and you have that knife. I'm concerned about you. It looks like you're really struggling, having a hard time. What's going on? Oh, you don't want to listen to me. No, we do want to listen to you. You look like you're in a lot of pain. So just kind of getting there, not just drop the knife, drop it. So that's a big part of it as well. And it's interesting because oftentimes, a lot of officers don't say this during the midst of the class, but they might grab me afterwards and they'll say, you know what, that was kind of a stressful challenge to do these scenarios in front of my peers. But I got to tell you, I learned a heck of a lot, not only from watching myself, but watching others. And they often talk about that button as well. And, you know, just being patient and kind of trust this process that it's actually doable and it can be actually quite successful. The training that we do for our dispatchers is very similar. Again, slowing it down, trying to get that caller to paint the picture, be it if it's that person in crisis or if it's a family member, to get as much information as possible, context, right? And then communicating that to the officers in a very clear, nice formulated way. So again, before they get there on scene or before they interact with that individual, they have as much background as they possibly can have. Anything else, Wes? Maybe we can take questions.
Yeah, I think we should take some questions. I'm sure some more will come as we go, but I want to make sure when we do these, like Mark talked about, Mark and I, at least, we tend to shy away from the PowerPoint presentations because we really want this to be more interactive. And certainly, you know, we've been feeding a lot of information that we think you would want to know. And that's based on a lot of times the questions we get at previous ones. But I want to make sure that before we walk out of here, you have an opportunity that if you're not clear on something, or if there's something we didn't cover, you know, that we can tailor this to address that as well. Any questions out there?
Any questions? Yeah, one thing I didn't mention, by the way, were the hours of our clinicians. So our clinicians, some start at 5 a.m. or usually that first shift starts at 6. And then the other bunch will come on in the afternoon and their shift will be over around midnight. We are not 24/7, but we are 365 days a year. And somebody had a question. Was it Jerry?
Bill.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I had a quick question. Have both of you been part of the PERT since the founding of it? And if so, what have you seen the progression of your duties, but also the acceptance of the officers and the clinicians?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I've been with PERT 6 years. I'm not quite sure, Bill, if you were there at the get-go. I've served as a police psychologist for some agencies for a long time. But again, in this small period, 6 years, I have seen a nice shift towards really being more eager to incorporate these skills and actually use them in the field. You know, it's one thing to go to a training. It's like, well, I got that, but I'm not going to use it, you know, because I'm stubborn. I'm going to do it like I always did. I'm not saying we used to get that, but there seemingly was sometimes a little bit of an undertow, maybe 6 years ago. But now we have officers coming in that are just eager to learn. And I must say on that, what really has changed also in the last few years, every new officer of the San Diego Police Department and the San Diego Sheriff's Department will have a PERT training typically within that first 30 days after they get their badges. Now we've been kind of put on the shelf a little bit under COVID, but we're going to be starting these trainings up again actually in February. You know, social distancing being what it is. Wes, you want to?
Yeah, so coming from, I have been only with PERT for 18 months, but like I said, I've been a utilizer as an officer. I was working Northern Division when PERT started. So from the very inception of PERT, I had access to it. And And I got to say, you know, when I started this career in the 80s, there were a couple of choices: jail, county mental health. And there was this giant chasm in between. So first of all, we've seen the world change as far as better care that's available. We've still got a long way to go, but there's better resources than existed years ago when I started. Officers have embraced PERT. And my experience with them, every time, for instance, if we've got to rearrange staffing because the hot team is going to be recommitted to do something else or whatever, and I need a place for clinicians, if I call some of the divisions, they're like, send us whoever you got. We will find a cop for him to work with. I'll take as many clinicians as you can send me. And so that's really the feel that I get out there from people. But on the flip side of this, so as a negotiator, when I would come on, people kind of similar mindset with the mental health, because obviously we're often dealing with some of the same kinds of challenges. It's just at the extreme level. And people would get resistant to, how long is this going to take? Well, it's going to take as long as it takes. So part of this has been a shift in the mindset of, so much of police work is got to get it done, got to go right now. There's always calls holding, got to get to the next thing. Everything's an emergency. Here we're seeing people start making a shift of, until I get here. Now I shut things down, I stop, and I'm going to pay attention. I'm going to take the time, because that's how this works. It doesn't happen fast. When you look at how to de-escalate, where there's intense emotion, there's lower rational thought. And you've got to lower that intense emotion before rational decision-making comes back. That's absent a mental health challenge. I mean, it can be intertwined, but that's just basic. You know, if somebody's really torqued off, think of your personal life. If someone you know is really mad and you go, hey, it's going to be okay, just get over it. What do they don't go, oh, you're right, I guess we're better. They react. It's no different in real life. So officers embrace it. I've been seeing that change for all these decades. I think they're open to different opportunities. Now, I know the community is. Fortunately, I feel like a time where everything's really ripe to explore what are better ways we could provide service and care out there. And I know, looking back on my career, it is not the action that I look back on with fondness. That stuff was scary. It is the fact that I never had to take a human life. And I can look back at many moments in my career where I know people who are alive today because of it. I can look at scenarios where I've walked in and the SWAT team's going, I don't know why you're here. This is going to be a gunfight. There's no way. And 6 hours later, we're walking out and they're going, oh my God, I thought there was no way that this would resolve peacefully. And someone's going out. And some of those are big, giant news events. Some of those happen very quietly and nobody knows. But I feel grateful for those moments.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Oh, sorry.
You got a follow up there, Bill?
Can I ask you
Jerry Hall has a question for you.
Hi
Yes,
guys,
Jerry.
thank you very much for the presentation, and I really do appreciate the PERT program. Ever since I've heard about it a few years ago, I want to bring up something that isn't. It's a tragedy, and I'm concerned because in 3 different cases with Alfred Alongo and Eric McNeil, and more recently that guy with the shovel who came running at the police. In all 3 cases, we knew that people were in mental distress, and we could have dispatched PERT with those officers. In National City, he turned himself in, and we could have clearly brought a PERT officer to the station. And in Earl McNeil's, or in Alfred Alongo's case, the sister called and said, he's in a mental health crisis. And then the guy with the shovel,
decided, I think I recall just somebody reported he decided not to wait for the PERT officer and just go down there and take action. So what, how do we stop that from happening again? Because it'll happen again if we don't really confront it head on. And I'm concerned because in two cases, they were black men, and then this other, the other guy was a white guy, but his aunt or something was down there and witnessed the whole thing. So I just, I'm concerned that is it a lack of officers or a lack of officers during the hours that were dispatched, or what went wrong there?
Well, yeah, I can't really comment on any specific case, but I can tell you that one good thing about PERT, I mean, we have limited resources, but we are cross-jurisdictional. So what that means is, say, National City Police Department could go, into Chula Vista, or vice versa, San Diego, and dispatchers are trained now to be able to look at their information in front of them and try to make that happen. So in our presentations, we try to put out the information. It's okay for a community member to request a PERT unit, or if a PERT unit is not available, to request a PERT trained officer. But sometimes there just are so many dynamics involved that PERT, even if we had 10 clinicians standing by, because of the safety aspect, we would not be able to engage. Trust me, if we are able to engage safely, we will do that. But paramount, we have to be cognizant of safety. And Wes, maybe you should comment from the law enforcement.
I don't think PERT was ever on scene with any of those three cases.
I totally get where you're coming from. And this is one of those things where, so like with the district attorney's training and this countywide protocol that we developed for de-escalation and for intervention, one of those components is disengagement, when continued engagement would only seem to create more risk. And then there's the component of slowing it down and having that plan beforehand. So laws have changed in the last couple of years about the expectations for officers responding to crimes, like Mark said, as far as having a plan and what are you doing before the event. Where we're at right now is, so the district attorney has funded training for de-escalation for every agency in this county. The commitment is every cop by the end of this will get through some de-escalation training. And we're even in discussions about what's the next phase of training beyond that, so that we address the perishability of those skills. But keep in mind, with 11 different agencies, a lot of the cycles of training that it takes to get through the officers that are out there, for instance, every agency has to do their update training with the California Post Commission for their license. And so every 2 years, there's a new cycle that every agency has to get all of their officers through for X number of hours just to keep their license together. But that's a 2-year cycle. So as we start doing this training and we start enhancing how we want to do stuff with dispatchers, how we want to do de-escalation with officers, how we want to look at the next phase of officers, we're suddenly starting to look at maybe a couple of rotations, 3 rotations, suddenly planning for how do we redesign the mindset of law enforcement in how they approach, is minimally a 2-year cycle to start having change. Now, that can have impact with PERT, where we're doing essentially menu style training where people can sign up and they can come on their own, or our negotiations team will provide maybe some training to their own team members to stay ahead of that. We continually here at PERT will look at things like Mark talked about autism. We brought a parents group in from the National Foundation for Autism to speak from the parent end and from the clinician end to our folks, to our officers, to our clinicians, to look at, hey, these are my fears as a parent. This would be the best way to approach my kid. This would be helpful ways to assess. So all of these things that are going on, it's really a commitment to that time and the investment in making those opportunities happen, because there are so many people that it's not just as easy as everybody just watches a quick video and it goes. This is really hands-on, transitional transformation kind of thinking that we have to have here. And that's, you know, the cops want it. No cop I ever met. It's really frightening on some of these. And I can tell you personally, when you're standing with somebody and they've got a 6-foot crowbar and they're saying, you step toward me, I'm going to plant this in your skull. And you're going, I don't want to do that. And they're going, demon, get away from me. And you know, that sometimes you have the opportunity to slow your roll getting into that. Sometimes you walk around the corner and the person's there and now you've got to engage. So there's a lot of complex factors that go on with that. I hope I answered that probably a little too much, but
Well, I'll just kind of tag something on. The PERT DA partnership de-escalation training is actually, it emanated out of state law. So by the end of this year, every law enforcement officer, actually in the state of California, will have to have that style of training. Of course, we're doing San Diego County. And I have to say, because I worked on a video project with Post the year before last, wherein I think there's 75,000 peace officers in California has to look at it. And the state is very proactive on crisis intervention for officers. And again, I'm just very proud to say that this county, it offers more than those mandates. It far exceeds the mandates. And I have to tell you, from my association with Post and through the California Crisis Intervention Training Association, CACITA, which involves roughly about 35 counties around California, where we kind of look at each other's programs. We are clearly ahead of many counties. Many counties have not done anything, no training at all for officers. We have the luxury of, you know, again, being in the service world for 25 years, but it's still, it's not good enough to me. There's always room for improvement. And actually, we're part of a state performance improvement project, or PIP for short, wherein we're actually looking at those people that we have contact with who do not need hospitalization, to do some kind of a follow-up with a peer to see if we can get them connected with services. Because what we found that a lot of people that we have contact with, you know, the intervention's fine on scene and we give them referrals, but they never show up. Right? So we're looking at ways we can connect for services. And again, I'm assuming probably stigma has a lot to do with this. Certainly it's been kind of tough under the COVID era here as well, but that's one area we're looking at. And another stat that might actually surprise you, I thought of, Jerry, when you posed your question, is that across this country, roughly a third of all calls coming into dispatch centers involve someone in a behavioral health crisis. You know, that's astounding. And, you know, a little bit, our stats last fiscal year, my gosh, we had over 12,000 crisis intervention contacts. I think there were close to 8,000 more that we were hoping to make contact, but we couldn't find the person. Maybe it was a homeless person in one of the canyons, or the person wouldn't answer their door. We also did roughly about 23,000 community service contacts, which would be consulting with family members, providers. So, I mean, there's a lot of contacts there, but still, you know, we get a sense sometimes it's not enough. Like in those scenarios, perhaps, Jerry, that you had mentioned, we do what we can do, but we're always looking at how can we be more available. In fact, the assignments of our PERT clinician come out of our Coordinating Council, which is comprised of our 11 local law enforcement partners and the DA's office. We look at what we call heat charts, or in other words, mental health type of calls coming into dispatch centers around the county. And so we can actually place clinicians where they might be needed the most. And hence, that's why the Central Division of San Diego Police Department has the most clinicians. Unfortunately, a lot of homeless people are suffering with severe and persistent mental illness, and so we want to be available to them. The other way, we're looking to always improve our services and to get tuned up with what's happening in our community. We have the PERT Advisory Committee, which is comprised of all kinds of members of the community. We have persons with lived experience. We have teachers, some law enforcement, people in the legal field, etc. And it's just kind of again a nice collaboration. So even though we have many things I think to brag about this county, we don't want to be complacent either, and that's why we are always changing the training, the 1 day and the 3 day, because I don't want an officer to say, oh yeah, I've been there, done that. I went there 2 years ago. It'll be the same thing. In some way, it might be the similar topic, but we will change the design. So those experiential exercises will be different, and they are challenging. You just can't sit there in the class and watch the clock roll.
Yeah, Lisa, I see you. I see you've got a question.
Yeah, I don't have a.
Pardon me, please. Robert Forte's had his hand up for.
Oh, sorry.
Robert can go first. Then I'll say something.
Thank you, Lisa. And
Lisa,
then we'll get to you next.
I'm sorry, ladies first. Go ahead, Lisa, and I'll be right after.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead, gentlemen.
Thank
Go
you,
ahead,
Robert.
Lisa.
So I will always tell my story about having the PERT team come and help me when I was sick, and before they had to take me to where I needed to be taken many years ago. And they took me to a hospital with kindness and compassion and caring. And now when I speak at the PERT Academy, none of the officers ever get to see what somebody well looks like. Like all of you might look at me and say, she didn't have mental illness. I am diagnosed, but that's not who I am. Mm-hmm. But what I want you to know is that Mark and Wes and the team really go out of their way to do what they can for somebody with mental illness. And it doesn't mean that they're going to judge them because they drop that judgment. And we do have some judgment before without realizing that, like how Mark said or Wes said, like, just stop it. Like my family said that too, just get a job, you'll feel better. And now when I have the privilege of talking to officers, and they come up to me and they'll share with me, my aunt has mental illness, and they like all of a sudden, like Mark says, when they take the information at the beginning, all of a sudden they feel comfortable sharing about their family, which is like that. It's much easier to share that you have an alcoholic in the family than that you have somebody with a diagnosis of mental challenges. So I just wanted to share that with all of you. So
thank you, Lisa.
Well, appreciate that. Good to see you, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you, Wes.
Thank you.
Appreciate it immensely.
So Robert,
thank you very much.
And Robert, thank you for letting me go first.
Yes,
that was nice too.
Yes, ma'am. So my question is my first is a statement. From what I heard Dr. Martin speak of and Mr. Albers speak of, was very interesting, but it drawed me to another conclusion that's very similar to the Superior Court, where the extensive training that the officers are getting comes nowhere close to the scope of practice that Dr. Martin has. And in the Superior Court, that line is blurred too, because we have judges, public defenders, and prosecutors assessing the mentally ill. And by no scope of practice is that even fair. And I just hope that line is not being blurred right now. That was my statement. My question is this: since COVID, year to date, has the numbers increased dramatically? And what are they?
Great. I appreciate your statement. I think you're spot on with that. With COVID, surprisingly, our numbers are pretty much the same as what they were a year ago. Now, there's one exception. We find people that are a bit hesitant to, be it voluntarily or obviously involuntarily, to be taken to a hospital because they're concerned about acquiring COVID. And the same can be said with outpatient resources, such as counseling. You know, of course, many of the clinics have been offering telehealth, you know, through a platform like Zoom, whatnot. But then we have to also recognize, unfortunately, a lot of folks out there, especially people who are homeless, they don't have computers or laptops or cell phones. Or if they have such, they have a very limited data plan that, you know, that's expensive, and they can't be sitting there having a counseling session. So I think that's been a tough, very tough part, is the connectivity. We have heard about the isolation aspects, obviously, which I think probably all of us have been impacted to a certain extent. But surprisingly, I was just drilling down the data earlier today, and the numbers are pretty much the same as what they were back then, say a year ago. But I mean, that's an excellent question.
It is, and keep in mind that you know, there's a lot of things that can influence numbers. But one of the things that we look at is we're still kind of locked down in a lot of ways. But if you're reading the news and you're looking at different studies that are coming out, obviously there seems to be concerns for some, you know, anxiety, depression, other issues that are going on. And we do think about, where are we headed and what might we need to deal with in 6, 12, 18 months as people start moving back out, maybe as divorces happen or people lose businesses or there starts to be impact from the home, a loss of a home, loss of a business. So we're constantly kind of looking at the future landscape of how that might be. And are there things we can do? What can we do to train and be prepared for that? And hopefully it doesn't come to pass, but if it does, at least we've put some thought into it. So we're constantly looking at lots of different angles.
Gentlemen, I want to say thank you, but you made a key point. Dr. Marvin, when you said that the numbers haven't went up, it tells you something. So that means that the expansion of the screening of the 911 operator needs to expand to a more traumatic screening, because the suicide rate is up, but the numbers aren't up on response.
Yes, I can't comment on those calls for services, say like after hours, and we're not available. I mean, these are things we're always obviously trying to look at, and I think you might be alluding to like the dispatcher training that I mentioned.
Absolutely.
To obviously get in there. And we do know that, you know, the one area probably with the kids issues, you know, early on and persisting actually, children contemplating taking their life, you know, big tragedy, you know, the isolation, for instance, and other aspects that can happen with that. So it's a very nice thought out point you make there. I appreciate the comment.
Likewise.
Thank you, gentlemen.
I have a question, and I hope it makes some sense. You know, you have folks that you may deal with on repeated times. Is the system integrated enough so that you could get them into court for the involuntary treatment? You know, there may not be put, you know, locked away, but I believe there's a law that allows for the court to compel people to participate in mental health treatment. And is the system integrated enough for that to be an option?
Yeah, well, initially, for our 5150 authority is merely to take someone to a hospital for further assessment for up to 72 hours. Are you talking about an extension beyond that the hospital might impose, or the hearing? Because I see in the audience, we have the one and only Mike Phillips of patient advocacy, who's actually like the state expert on these matters. Mike, chip in.
Mark, I think Brian's referring to Laura's Law. Brian, does that sound familiar?
Yes, that sounds familiar, yes.
Okay,
Mark,
thank you.
I can speak to it, but Mark, this is your presentation.
Oh, go for it, Mike.
Okay, so Brian, Laura's Law is essentially, as you described, a mandated outpatient treatment. It takes quite a few steps to qualify for it, and there's 9 different criteria that have to be met. And so it's one of those concepts that sounds like it might be good in certain situations, but it is actually fairly difficult to qualify for that. And you actually have to have multiple hospitalizations or other indicators before you qualify for that. The goal is to catch someone before they cross that 5150 threshold and have them provided with services that will hopefully prevent the need for that. And individuals, human beings, we ebb and flow. On one day, maybe we're meeting all 9 of those criteria, and other days we are not. So the voluntary services that mirror the concept around Laura's Law, the in-home outreach team, outreach where there's a lot of efforts to provide those services, especially on a voluntary basis. So there's a lot there. I tend to talk a lot, so I'm going to stop there and see if that's helpful.
Well, that's okay. It's interactive. I appreciate it, Mike. We at PERT, we do make as referrals as what fits the criteria, the 9 difficult criteria, as what Mike was saying. And also about a little over a year and a half ago, perhaps, with the folks that provide that case management services for Laura's Law, we met with the San Diego Police Department to hopefully ensure additional referrals into that program. So, but I think it has been successful in this county. I know other counties around the state, maybe not so much. I'm not quite sure about what that's all about, but it is an option for us.
Just so you guys know, there's about 5 or 6 questions in the chat as well. I don't know if anybody's seeing that.
I saw Chantel raising her hand. I don't know if there's someone, did you have a question?
I was just going to say the same thing. There's a bunch of questions in the chat box, and I'm not sure if you're going to be addressing them.
Yeah, let me look at them right now.
There's quite a few of them.
Okay. Yeah. You want to read one, Wes?
Yeah, so the first one from Jerry Hall, our county is looking to add mobile crisis units where they can be called or dispatched in lieu of police. Also, there's legislation coming up where all counties will be required to have such mobile response teams by the year 2027.
Yeah, that was just more something I learned in a training today, but
okay.
About 6 boxes up, there's some questions that start and work all the way down.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. Yeah, mobile crisis response teams certainly do have a place and have a place in our county's system of care as well. Currently, there's a pilot project going on up in the North Coastal region that the provider Exodus is providing up there. And most of these calls, their calls for service would emanate out of the 211 system, pretty much like a crisis line type of system. There is an RFP, request for proposal, that has been released for seeing about all 5 county regions to be involved in that. So we see PERT working tandem. Again, it's collaboration that works, and there's certainly probably a segment of folks that could benefit from that program that perhaps PERT would not need to be involved with, and the coexisting nature of the 2 programs would be wonderful.
So to go to the questions here, I'll take these first couple here kind of as the same. So how diverse is the group of clinicians working with PERT? And then who determines when a PERT clinician is deployed with officers? So our clinicians are predominantly women, which is just the applicants that we get. Now, these are not entry-level clinicians, so all of them come from a variety of different disciplines. We have representation from a lot of different communities. We have a pretty diverse group. We have a number of people speaking different languages, and you know, we're really open to anybody that comes in. Kind of as a negotiator, that was one of the things that I recognized early on. We would have a number of different people on our team, because as an officer, sometimes if you call me out in the field, you get who shows up. But if I'm doing a negotiation, sometimes you want somebody that might connect a little bit different. And sometimes people we're negotiating with might have a preference, might have a bias that we need to get and be able to connect with. So we do look at how do we keep that going. Primarily, though, our applicants are women. We do have a number of male clinicians. Now, who decides when they're deployed with officers? So that goes back to what Mark talked about with the coordinating council. We will look at those heat maps and what are the days a week, times of day, regions in San Diego County that have the most need. And then we will allocate clinicians to those areas in anticipation of that. And so then, for instance, for San Diego Police, if you're downtown, if you're one of that concentration of clinicians, it would be Central Division, the captain ultimately for that command, who would decide which of their officers are going to ride with a clinician. Our preference is that they've gone to the 3-day, but like Mark also said, every San Diego officer, every sheriff's department officer goes through PERT training within that first 30 days out of the academy, so they can ride with any officer. Some of the smaller agencies actually dedicate an officer to work with the clinician. So the clinician and the officer might be a team all 4 days of the week, and then they can develop a real, kind of partnership there.
Yes, thank Wes. And also cultural implications are a part of all of our trainings. We look at that, one of our one-day trainings, for instance, we have officers looking within their service zone. So for instance, if we have officers from, say, Mid-City Division of San Diego Police Department, we are looking at the East African refugee community, for instance, which we have involved in our PERT trainings in the past, pre-COVID era presentations as well, to try to make a link with communities. And one thing, I don't know if Wes, if you had indicated this, but if there is a language barrier, we are able to utilize translation services, which actually work out really, really nice. And those folks are quick to respond on the scene. But we're always looking, diversity issues, cultural implications. Absolutely.
And to talk on that cultural competency, we do quarterly training. We've talked about the officer training, but we do quarterly training for our own people, where every quarter we take an entire day off and we bring people in. We do a full 8 hours of training, and a big component of that every quarter is some kind of expansion of cultural understanding. We want to improve awareness. And so that kind of leads into this next question, and I'll talk about how we might utilize the resources, because we've touched on it a little bit. So I'm the mother of 3 elementary age children. Our son is autistic. His fight or flight impulse response system is very intense, impulsive, and unpredictable. We have come close to calling the non-emergency line and asking for PERT assistance, but have been hesitant based on national stories with unfortunate outcomes. So first off, thank you for bringing this up, because this is something that, and as we go into the questions, so like I talked about, we brought parents of autistic children. National Foundation for Autism Research came in and did presentations. And what I specifically asked them to do, and this was to not only our clinicians, but to their officer partners, is address as a parent or as a clinician dealing with an autistic child or even an adult, What would you want law enforcement and clinicians to know when responding, when engaging, and when doing the assessment? Because it's not just the response, there's certainly more to that component. Now, autism is not a mental health, it's a developmental disability. So there's similarities, but we're not, there are some distinctions. So if you call and request a PERT team, is the first part of this question. Will you be told if a PERT team is available to respond before officers show up? So that would really depend on the agency. Unfortunately, so many of the answers to questions that we have are maybe and it depends. That's the unfortunate reality. But you may. I encourage people when I'm telling them to call is request a PERT unit. And request a PERT unit if available. But regardless of if they're available or not, whether it's PERT or just officers, tell them that you have information you want to provide that might help with the assessment or the management of this situation. And to have them please contact you as soon as it's safe to do so, even before responding, if they're capable. Because that gives you an opportunity to provide that input. Hey, this is my son. This is the challenge he has. This is what we found are the best ways to do it. This is what you might encounter. All of those are things that can help, even if it's not a PERT unit that's responding, in the understanding of how to make that approach. And in a similar story, there was one that was on YouTube or the news a few months ago down in Chula Vista, where family had a parent with a traumatic brain injury. And so that anger and the impulse control that was so indicative of his injury, they really clearly articulated how that manifested. And the officers, you could hear them when they got there. You could hear the sergeant going, remember, traumatic brain injury, keep your distance. Let's manage this. They took that into account. So how we give that information is important, because the more information that we have, the more whoever's responding can assist with that. At least that's the hope. But we do see many instances where, that's why we advocate for that. What is the probability of a PERT team being available versus regular officers? Well, again, we work from pretty much 6 a.m. till midnight. It's hard to say. It's kind of like when you're calling police, will they be available to come take your car burglary report, or will this be 3 days of waiting before somebody comes out? That's such a random kind of, I can't say without knowing what the calls for service at the moment would be. They prioritize calls for service from emergency all the way through basically a paperwork call. So where somebody fits on that hierarchy for triage can really also have influence on determining the priority with which that gets accessed. And determining priority really comes down to articulating the behaviors that are going on. Obviously, the more volatile, the more imminently threatening, the higher the priority. And so how we articulate those behaviors is important. And then the last I see, we've registered with the Sheriff's Department Safe Return. So the Take Me Home program, we're a big advocate. And when we partnered and we had the discussion on autism, that was really the primary kind of that they were recommending was the Take Me Home. And since they're the one that gets the most attention, I think that it's safest to go with what people know. Anything further that I didn't get on that, or Mark, did you have any?
No, thanks, Wes. I think you covered it splendidly.
So,
Well, I think, yeah, painting the picture, if you need to call, and someone had put in a comment about that anxiety, if not fear. What if I call 911 and the officers aren't compassionate or don't slow it down, and we have a terrible outcome, which might result in maybe my loved one being involved in a shooting? Yeah, that's a very painful, challenging scenario to face. When you're calling 911, just paint that picture. As Wes just said, I think that was great. Behavioral stuff. You don't want to say something like, my adult son has a bad attitude. Put that into behavioral terms. What's happening? Talk about the history. Because again, we're going to train as many dispatchers as we can in this. I mean, they have something basic, but we're really stepping it up with them, and we're telling them, you really got to dive deep. You really have to take many layers off the onion, as we say, to really engage in that person. And if the person who's calling, in this case maybe a loved one, isn't providing that information, be curious and ask. Engage in a dialogue. Don't be just dependent on the information that is provided to you. Because in crisis, it's hard to think, to stay clear and contextually. So to help that person who's calling, dive around in there with them and try to get that information to make this eventual contact a very successful and compassionate contact.
And if you're at home, Mark brings up a good point about crisis, because I'm going to tell you right now, even after, starting to approach my 40th year toward 35 years of doing this stuff, in that immediate part of the crisis, no matter how many times I've been to chaos, the first few minutes is still some degree of chaos. And you don't think through every little thing, because that's the nature of that. That's why it's chaos. And so sometimes it helps if you're coming from a standard position, say from home, that you would be calling, to have something written down and put in the drawer by your phone of things that you would want to say that might trigger a reminder, just bullet points of what your concerns are, what the behaviors are that you're trying to articulate, and what are tools that officers or the clinician might employ to keep your loved one safe. And that way you're not trying in that first moment of chaos to think through all of that stuff and remember it, because it's difficult. And if that's me after decades of doing this, I totally recognize the horribly difficult spot that could put you in. So just little reminders of things that might trigger those memories.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
It sounds like Anita.
Yes, it is. Hi.
Hi, Anita.
Hi. This has been great. I'm glad you're doing this. Wait, I'll go off so I can see people as well. Let's see. There I am.
Okay.
All right.
With my fake ocean background. I just wanted to add, especially for the parent that just spoke, I am a family member. I have an adult son who lives with serious and persistent illness. I also have been on the PERT advisory committee for probably 10 years now. And I also have done the trainings along with Lisa. We call ourselves the lived experience panel, where we speak to the officers about our lived experience. I've had to make the calls and with that, but also our committee developed something called the emergency response plan. Mm-hmm. And that might be helpful for family members to complete. Because you can't think of everything when you're in crisis. And I'm speaking from experience as well. Yeah. And so that form, which is on the, I believe it's on the PERT website, it's on the NAMI website, it's on the San Diego County Behavioral Health website, but you can print that off. It has tips on the back about how to make the environment safe for when law enforcement comes. On the front, you can fill out things about, they're very attached to their cat or their their dog, and maybe if you allow them to have that close by, so you're able to complete that and have it available. And I believe the officers are supposed to ask about that form, that if do they have an
Yes.
emergency response plan. So I
Yep.
just wanted to throw
That's
that
great.
in
Thank
there.
Yes, thank you, Lisa.
Mhm.
Yeah, ERP for short. If you go to the Community Research Foundation, or again, our parent company's website on PERT, you will see the ERP form. I think we have it on there in different languages. It's also on the county website as well. Thank you. Thank you, Anita. Other questions? Any myths we can dispel?
I have another question. You had mentioned that there is a professional organization of people in your business that you, or at least that there are other groups like you around the state, and is that has that group developed standards for staffing, or is there legislation changes to the law that they're advocating?
That's a great question. The California Crisis Intervention Training Association, or CASITA for short. CASITA, I always like to say it's not a Spanish term of endearment for a small house. It just happens to be the acronym CASITA. But we have periodic meetings. I happen to be an advisory board member, and we're just kind of looking at how things are happening throughout the state, and we can advocate. And for like myself, as I mentioned earlier, POST, which really oversees law enforcement training in all areas, but including behavioral health issue areas, been able to get involved and enlighten that organization, again, with some of our mental health handbook that we have had distributed to every peace officer in California, our interactive video series that we did, and we can really step it up. Also, we had it's been about a year ago, a little over a year ago, a statewide de-escalation task force, which I was part of. A lot of sharing, and from that came this de-escalation mandate that we talked about earlier, that through the PERT partnership with the DA's office that we're holding, wherein I think I mentioned every peace officer in California has to attend this sort of training somewhere in the state this calendar year. So it is powerful. And the other thing is we're available not only within California but outside California. We get reach outs from major cities across the countries who are interested in this program. Some are interested also in the non-law enforcement connected, but many major cities of recently, since last summer with the murder of George Floyd, for instance, there's been a lot of focus on these programs, heightened focus. They said, we really want to do what you're actually doing in San Diego, because we see many benefits to our community for that. So we're not actually going in there and training them, but we are available for consultations. And I tell you, I've been quite stunned, frankly, by some of the major cities in this country that really there have been no collaborative efforts between behavioral health services and law enforcement. I mean, it just astounds me. And but that's starting to shift out there, and we try to promote these practices, which we consider best practices out there in the community. Because as I mentioned earlier, nationwide, about a third of calls coming into 911 centers involve someone who has a mental health variable in that call.
Well, and it leads into a question here that I saw that I wanted to address, even though we've kind of talked to it a little bit. But if we want to change the culture of a society, of a group within society, whether it's society as a whole, whether it's law enforcement, whether there's things we want to change. One of the side benefits of PERT, someone asked earlier, is what have we seen as far as the acceptance of law enforcement? Well, having people in the police car, clinicians in the police car who come from a whole different lens on how this happens has influenced law enforcement culture within the community of San Diego to some degree. The more we have that opportunity to walk in the shoes of another and look through their lens and to do it next to each other, the more we see the change we want to have, because we bring in those diverse opinions. So this is one of those things that for me, as I look back, I think, oh my God, imagine if they hadn't put the clinician in the car, where law enforcement in this county would be with regard to their perspective of mental health and law enforcement. And that change happened by pairing unlikely partners. So there's a question here then that leads into this that says, is PERT training mandatory for all officers? So like we said, for sheriffs, police department, yes. All of the other agencies in the county attend our training. They support, they provide officers for PERT clinicians. They do training. I think far and away, the super majority percentage of our county has now been trained on some access or level of training with PERT. So it goes into, I ask because as an autism advocate and parent, I've assisted autism professionals in giving autism disability trainings, and very few officers attend. My Black son with autism has been racially harassed, and it was clear that they had zero knowledge of what autism looks like. It's especially dangerous for Black persons with autism, as many of their symptoms can look like threats to an untrained police officer, to PD. Many people with autism have fleeting eye contact, communication issues, sensory issues, difficulty following instructions, difficulty staying still, and huge anxiety that can send them into fight or flight mode. In my experience with my Black son with autism, police are not trained to distinguish what these autism symptoms are. So we've talked about some of the things we're doing to get more access, and certainly we will continue. As a parent, that's a fear that our children can do things that maybe they quickly find themselves in over their head. And that's in the best of circumstances. So now we're talking about an issue with autism and understanding of the nature of autism with a racial component. And that can, so this is where, when we're communicating, when we're calling, when we're looking for help, this is where it gets really important to have that pre-thought out plan for how do we communicate. To me, that was a tremendous statement of concern about what I would need to look out for if I was addressing your child, of things that I would want to be aware of. And it's funny because when we've started, Mark and I have also, since this meeting and the training we've had, we're having this discussion in the academy. And one of the questions is, how many of you have a friend or a family member with autism? And that's also a huge number of hands, because it's a spectrum. One of the sayings that really resonated with me in that training and in my partnership with this group is, one of the statements was, if you've met a person with autism, you know one person with autism. And it's that there is no, it's not everybody. Everyone is different and unique. So communication of what those behaviors are, how they show up, how they might be misinterpreted, and ways that you have been able to manage that will help. Now, the second part of why I wanted to talk about this is from a satisfaction, a harassment, or a feeling of harassment, whatever the case is, it's a even if it's just a miscommunication of intents. I am a big advocate in every training I do, whether it's clinical to law enforcement to the community. I'm a big advocate that if we're feeling like a scenario, law enforcement's come out, PERT's come out, we're talking through the situation, we're trying to figure out a solution, and we feel like it's not going down the right path. Elevate for a supervisor. And it doesn't have to be, I want to talk to the boss. It can be something as simple as, I feel like maybe I'm not communicating appropriately. Maybe I'm not giving you what you need, but I feel like we're not getting to the right resolution here. Could we get a supervisor maybe to help talk this through? If a clinician's there, our clinicians have a team leader. They have a field operations supervisor. PD has a sergeant. A sergeant will have more experience. Often, most of our cops out there, they're 3 years on maybe. So there's a lot of inexperience, and helping them navigate ways to maybe make appropriate decisions or think of options that their limited experience might not be thinking about is okay. So please don't be afraid. And if they don't bring a supervisor and they drive off, nothing stops you from calling back to communications and simply saying, wow, I'm confused. This doesn't feel like this should be the solution. Could you have a supervisor call me? And that could result in a recontacting and a change, or it could be that what's really happened is that the officer was not capable of explaining why their decisions are. Doesn't mean they were wrong. They just can't explain it, and a supervisor can do a better job. But rather than letting that happen and not reaching out and asking for that clarification, then we just fill in our own blanks. And so that's an opportunity for all of us to kind of just push it up a little bit. And I know in all the years that I was a supervisor, over 20 years supervising as a training officer, as a sergeant, as a detective sergeant, never afraid of the question about why did I or my people do something a certain way. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, great.
Thank you. Can I add to something? That was my message. That was my. So I appreciate your comment. I really appreciate you discussing it. Thank you so much for that time. I just want to say regarding like talking to a supervisor and asking those important questions. You know, we are on an NAACP format, so we are all hopefully conscious of the differences that Black people face with police officers.
Sure.
So I think that I would think that Black parents on here are going to understand what I'm saying. Having that conversation as a Caucasian is going to be a lot easier than as a Black parent.
I understand.
It's not, you know, the way you described it sounded really easy. And it's not the case when you're dealing with a police officer that's racially profiled your child. They're not usually very humble. If they had racially profiled your child, you're not going to find that officer to be humble and say, "Oh, let's talk about that. Let's have a dialogue." That's not usually going to happen. So it sounds beautiful what you just described, but in reality, when you are facing a situation where a racial injustice happened, that's not gonna work for Black people. It's just not going to, you know, so I just want to explain that it's a different scenario. And I just also want to explain that in this scenario, my son was 11 years old. He's a very big Black boy. And my son thinks that police officers are heroes. He thinks they're really cool and he loves a uniform. And he pointed at an officer's badge and he said, "Shiny." That's all he said. He doesn't have a lot of words. And because he pointed and said "shiny," this young officer got really uncomfortable and he immediately put his hand on his gun holster and he leaned towards us and he yelled, "What did he say? What did he say?" really aggressively with his hand on his gun. And thankfully, he had an older partner with him. And he said, calm down, calm down. And he said, "What's going on?" I said, "My son has autism and he doesn't know that pointing his finger at an officer would trigger him. You know, he just wanted to compliment him on his badge." You know, my heart was racing because that is completely a ridiculous response to give a child. But of course, all he saw was a big Black boy. That's all he saw. So, you know, thankfully the older officer was there, but had he not been there, I don't even want to think of what would happen. And this was La Mesa PD. And, you know, as we're going through this PERT discussion, I was looking it up and I don't see La Mesa PD having PERT. I don't know if all these, my question to you is PERT training mandatory now? Is it suddenly changed? Because you know, the last I heard, disability training is not mandatory. So is it changed where it is mandatory, and is PERT training available to all departments?
Absolutely, it is available to all departments, and we are connected with the La Mesa Police Department as well, PERT clinician staff there. Mandated, all the agencies, you know, strongly encourage officers to attend PERT training. Again, to be a PERT officer riding with a PERT clinician, you have to go through the 3-day PERT Academy training. Again, I think I mentioned earlier, both the San Diego Sheriff's Department and San Diego Police Departments mandate their newly badged officers to go through. And my hope is that we can convince all the agencies to do likewise, you know, within a given time period. Now, granted, during their police academy training, there's quite an extensive crisis intervention curriculum in the midst of that. However, my belief is that, you know, you're being inundated with lots of information, and then once you get your badge, you're out there in the field, and then we can kind of slow it down and really capitalize and go into it perhaps a little more in depth and kind of push their buttons as well. You know, I think that's vital for training to be effective. But it is strongly encouraged, and this de-escalation training is state mandated. Our partnership with DA, every officer has to attend that this calendar year. If you're a field training officer, which actually is like a supervisor of the new officers who have come out of the academy and they're newly badged, you have to attend a training, which we do provide within 180 days of that field training officer, that FTO assignment. So there are some state mandates. The post video production that I was involved with a little over a year ago is mandated to watch too. It's very highly interactive video thing where you can't just fast forward it, you know, and get done with it. It takes, I forget how many hours. It's a multiple day training. Post, and I agree with this, we view these skills as highly perishable skills. You know, even if you are using these skills, and we kind of equate them to almost as if they're tools in the toolbox, not to just get stuck into using the one tool all the time, but you have to come back and refresh, and you might have a different feel or look, especially I think with newer officers who maybe have had some kind of a life free from trauma, or maybe really haven't had any experience interacting with persons living with severe mental illness. You know, maybe they didn't have that in their family, or maybe they grew up in a very small community where, you know, psychologists, you know, what are those? You know, that type. I grew up in a community like that in Michigan, believe it or not. But it's then when they get out there in the field and they encounter people, they might have a very different view. And now, in fact, we've had people come back multiple times for our training, simply because they have realized that with their experience out in the field, it kind of gives them a different perspective, and they want to see, okay, I thought I had this certain skill down, but now autism is a great example, actually. Now I wanted a little bit of a refresher on that. Actually, a few years ago, there was an officer, I won't name the precise agency, from the Los Angeles area, who was like reprimanded and sent down here to our 3-day training to be as some kind of sensitivity training. I thought, oh, this is going to be wonderful. Because the guy had somewhat of an attitude the first day, but I tell you, by the end of the first day, he had totally changed his tune. In fact, he came back actually 2 more times in the last 4 years and brought some of his fellow officers. So it's kind of like what I like to refer to as idea tasting. If you're not familiar with this, you have to kind of taste it, you know, and utilize it. Get out there. And if you're in the class, think, how's this going to make life a better place for someone out there in the world? And how's it going to enhance my life and my well-being, my stress level? So we try to hit it from multiple areas. But, you know, Robin, what your experience is just horrific and totally uncalled for. And it's those sorts of buttons that we kind of are going after, for lack of a better phrase, when we do training. So these are not easy trainings to sit through. Again, an officer has to be introspective, and we will intentionally go after people's buttons if we realize they have some buttons that need to be gone after. I don't know how else to word that, because that's what this is all about. It's you know, responding to people to protect and serve, and to do that in a very compassionate way. And I think for many to do that, you have to kind of be aware of your own stuff. You know, again, your own buttons and your own biases, many biases, including, you know, cultural biases, diversity biases as well.
And
I appreciate your comment, Robin.
And I want to just close that off with one thing, Robin, because I could hear the frustration and the pain in your voice when you're talking to me. So I recognize that that's a difficult conversation for you. And so if not the officer, if not their supervisor, most agencies have a community relations officer. They have a liaison officer that maybe not in the moment, but maybe after the fact, that's an opportunity to develop a relationship, reach out and see what might exist there. I don't know on that end for La Mesa, but I would think that there would be someone that would listen to those concerns from an end of, is there something more we could be doing from the service end? Sometimes with the young officers, when we go into that inexperience, Mark talked about that emotional intelligence. You know, you get someone young from there right out of the academy. There would be times, for instance, I'd be sitting on the bridge and I've got someone on the ledge and they're 15 feet from me. And so I'm down on a knee, so I'm eye level with them. I know I can get behind a car before they get up and come at me. So I have some safety. I'm lowering the tone of my voice. We're working on making a connection. But I look behind me and the officers that are there to protect me are standing how they were trained in the academy, you know, at the side, ready to go, or they're standing like this, and their body language is telling that person, I'm gonna get you as soon as I can, even though that's not what they're not even aware that they're doing that. And some of these things that we learn, you know, some of what made me good at what I did was not the things that I learned to do right, but the things that I screwed up and I had to learn how to do better. And so sometimes we're just not aware. And I'm not trying to minimize, I'm not trying to justify or explain those actions. I have no idea. From your voice, I know it's painful. So I'm just trying to look at, you know, if there are other options. Because me as a police supervisor, if that was what somebody was feeling when one of my people were out there, that rattles me. So I thank you for that.
I appreciate your comments, and you know, and I thank you for that information. In case, I mean, I hope this never happens again. So thank you for that information. That yes, when you know, if you get to a safe place, that you can call somebody else to talk to. You know, as a parent though, and being an autism advocate, and just, you know, I'm very privy to what's happening in the world. And when you're an autism parent and you work in the field of autism, you are more aware of what happens in the autism community. You're more aware than most people. I'm very aware of the deaths that happen. I'm more aware than probably most cops, because it's what happens to the sons and daughters that have the same affliction my son has. And so the rates of people being harmed by police that have disabilities, especially people of color, are astronomical. And so, while it's great to know that while things cool down, you can go and call, just wanted to say, just throw it out that our biggest concern as parents that have, children of color with disabilities is, are you going to come out alive? That is the biggest concern, and the afterthought is like, oh, okay, we'll call a supervisor. But really, the biggest
I understand.
thing is, are you going to survive? Like, that's the biggest thing, because that's the reality. The reality is they don't think, oh, they see fleeting eye contact. They see you're not making eye contact. They see you looking down. They see that you're fidgety. Oh, he must be evading something. He must be a criminal. The mindset is not, oh, those are symptoms of autism. So that should be in the forefront, and so anyway, I won't get into a big conversation about that, but I appreciate you letting me know that there are, avenues to go to, but I hope that all of our kids get to the point where we can call somebody after. I just don't want any parent to not get.
Totally agree.
Yeah, and thank you, Robin. In fact, maybe at some point, once we kind of get over this COVID thing, if you're interested, maybe we could, it's totally up to you, of course, to do a little video that we could show for our training. We do have occasionally, different panels, cultural issues, but yeah, video we can show. I think that would be, I would be quite appreciative of the time, so feel free to reach out to us here at the PERT office, and I'd be really interested in doing that.
Of course.
And thank you. And somebody on the chat said, hey, are you guys hiring? Actually we are. I think we have roughly 3 or 4 openings right now. Sometimes, transition people leave. So if you are interested, or you know of someone who's licensed, go to the Community Research Foundation web page, and you'll see a careers page on there, a link to apply. That would be really nice. And Anita, thanks. I see Anita in the chat box put in the link to the ERP, the Emergency Response Plan form that we had discussed about a half an hour ago. So thanks for that, Anita. Are there anything else?
Well,
I have a question.
I feel a little bit like a skunk at the picnic because we reached our 8 o'clock hour. Dr. Brown, our committee chairman, would certainly have some words to say to us before as we get ready to sign off.
Well, I don't have many things to say except thank you all for your participation and coming to this. I have learned a lot, and the entire conversation was very inspirational for me. It is lit a fire under me about some things that I should have probably thought of. Chris, that means that I'll probably be involved in your subcommittee as well. But the one question I have for Doctor, do you allow, and someone may have said this, or Anita may have talked about it, if you live in a city, do you allow maybe a parent or someone who has a child with autism or other challenges to come to your department and meet with someone and sort of like be proactive? You may have answered this, and I apologize if I didn't hear it, by giving you pictures and talking to you, giving you an address, so you can make sure that when you're responding to that area, you happen to get a call there, you have as much information as possible regarding what could come about there. Do you encourage that, or did I miss that? Did someone talk about that?
Yeah, that's certainly something we do encourage. Wes, do you want to, I don't know if you can speak on behalf of any agency out there about protocol for doing such?
So there's the Take Me Home program. That's really kind of up to each of the 11 agencies for how they document it. Most agencies have something that they can put in. It's called a PAC file, where it could be an awareness of something that might be important to know for that. So that would really be a call to your individual agency and say, hey, I would like to provide information that maybe you could keep on file. regarding my address. So if you engage with my son, daughter, husband, wife, whomever, that you are aware of this. And that individual agency would probably be best suited to talk about how they might document that. And again, most agencies have like a community relations officer. So for San Diego Police, every command, every station has a community relations officer who can start to have those discussions. And if something doesn't exist, maybe explore making something exist. But from that end, we go out with law enforcement, but the tracking of it, the communications, this is why we have the call go to dispatch, because the management of that call, so it doesn't get lost, of that information, all of that goes through their computer aided dispatch to do that. So they're really kind of, I would direct you to check with them and say, hey, what might we be able to do here for providing you some upfront information?
Yeah, and feel free to say that it came up in a PERT town hall too.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, and we will actually bring this up at our next coordinating council meeting, which is comprised of the higher ranked person in each of our 11 agencies that oversee PERT. So we'll definitely bring this issue up.
Okay.
Appreciate the question.
Thank you. Go ahead, Chris. Would you like to say something? Thank you for bringing all this together, Chris. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing, Chris?
Just that I'm just extraordinarily grateful to Dr. Marvin and to everyone on NAACP for supporting this and helping put this together. Just a quick plug: this is put on by the local NAACP's subcommittee on mental health and policing. So if anyone's interested in getting involved, I put the email address in the chat a couple of times. It's just info@SanDiegoNAACP.org. And we're going to be, this is actually kind of a kickoff event for our subcommittee. The next meeting is going to be on the 15th at 6 o'clock. We're going to be writing out our charter, including vision, mission statements, and coming up with some specific goals. So that's all for me. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Chris, thanks for the reach out. Again, we're very honored to be part of this. Brian, thanks. And certainly Dr. Brown, fellow members. This is a great experience for us. I feel really good about this. Again, it's all about collaboration and getting information, accurate information out there in the community. So I appreciate your sensitivity, appreciate the very personal and painful disclosures that you have made. And if there's anything we didn't answer, if you want to kind of go offline with that, just reach out to the PERT office, and we'll certainly respond to you. And hopefully you'll make some referrals, maybe some in the audience who might want to be a PERT clinician or want to be part of training in some capacity. Don't be shy. Reach out. We want to have you. All about community. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
I'm going to take some advantage of being the VP here. One of the things that we're very interested. We're an advocacy organization, and we would certainly appreciate any help from you and the PERT team of things that we ought to advocate. We know that we're not the experts, but we would certainly appreciate an ongoing conversation with you. So this should not be a one and done kind of event. I think this, we have the opportunity to build a relationship that could benefit both parties here.
Absolutely. Remember, as I mentioned at the top of this, the birth of PERT came out of community members getting together, looking to improve the way things are being done. So, we're always looking to evolve. So thanks for that. We'll take you up on that for sure. And
we've gone almost 10 minutes over, and I appreciate everybody's patience and interest in sticking sticking with us to the end. And if there's any last thing that Dr. Brown wants to say, we'll go ahead and let people get back to the things that they also have to do.
I'm good, Chris. Brian, but thank you to all of you. It's been fantastic, and we like to have some more of these types of PERT Town Hall intermittently, if we can. You know, maybe we can schedule them. I'll let Chris decide that when we maybe have like an annual or something like that, just to make sure that we stay in touch. We continue doing, because it's something we may all or know someone need this help or this resource. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and good night.
And
thank you.
Good night. Thank you. Take care.
Okay, you guys have a great evening now.